Hello. For my presentation today, I decided to interview my mom, the quilter. After showing you a sample of her work in my group project earlier this semester, I thought it would be interesting to introduce you to the woman that made those quilts. So you've already gained an idea of how they are made from my previous presentation. You now have a chance to learn the background of where and why they were made. So when did you actually start quilting?
I started quilting when I started having kids and needed to have covers for their beds, but I started sewing back probably in '69, and I learned from my grandma. My mom could sew a button on a shirt or fix a hem in a pair of pants, but she didn't sew. And my grandmother lived with us for most of my childhood, and she didn't quilt, but she had 13 children, had one of them in a hospital. The rest she had at home. Grew up in Wisconsin. They only had shoes when they went to school in the winter. And she never had a pattern, but she sewed clothes for her daughters. And back then you could buy 10 or 20 pounds of flour in a flour sack, and it was material. And you'd save the material and wash it up. And when you had enough, you could sew a shirt or apron. And she would sew Barbie clothes for me by taking her old dresses apart and just cutting a piece and sewing it into doll clothing. But she would laugh and giggle and say if all of her daughters saw her doing that, they'd probably think she'd entered her second childhood. But I learned to sew from her, and my mom bought a sewing machine, and I discovered quickly that I could have a lot more clothing if I went to the store and bought a couple yards and a pattern and could alter the pattern and get 3 different looks from one pattern. And when I was in high school, I loved to make my own clothes because they were always different and unique from everybody else's. Of course, back then it was tie-dyed and big flared pants and all that. But then I'm trying to think of when I even started to quilt. I think I did a baby quilt when I had my first child in '77, and I had a friend that lived in Maine, and she later moved back down to Cape Cod in Massachusetts, but she had made a quilt for the crib for my son, and I made one for her. And I thought, well, if she can do it, I can do it. So I had a little Kenmore sewing machine and went to work on that and made my first one. Then I made one for my own son that was puffy squares, and he had that for many years. And then I made a log cabin quilt for our bed. And then we moved to Iceland, and I really didn't do much sewing there because there wasn't a lot of material that appealed to Americans, but I did buy a beautiful piece of Irish lace while I was there that I've kept with me all this time and use it for curtain.
What were some reasons of why you wanted to quilt?
I know that when people like me who kind of have the bug about quilting and sewing, when they enter a quilting store and they see all that fabric, their heartbeat just starts to go faster, and their high blood pressure probably gets higher. They get so excited about it. But you always have to have work on your fabric stashes, and so you know, one piece of material might inspire you and you can do a whole quilt off of one piece, and then other times you have a piece of material sitting on a shelf for years and you look at it every once in a while and think, what can I do with that? And I actually have a piece of material that has inspired me, but I just haven't thought of how to put it together with a whole quilt yet. It probably seemed like it was a necessity to quilt because we did live in Maine and we lived in upstate New York, and it was cold. And to buy a lot of blankets for 5 beds, 6 beds, it'd be, and to me it was like I always felt that we were getting more when I would sew something than if you went to a store and bought something that you weren't really happy with. And this bear claw I did in the late 80s when we lived in Maine, and I had it all pieced together, and we went camping up way north in Maine at Baxter State Park. And the kids took a canoe out on a little creek, and everybody was out fishing and in the woods, and I was sitting by the tents hand quilting it, and I had it laying over my lap, and I did spill some purple, probably grape juice on it, washed it out with water from the cooler, and I was just sitting there quilting along, and I kind of felt something was staring at me or looking at me, and I looked up, and there was a big moose standing probably 10 feet away from me. And he didn't care. He just was looking at me, and I looked at him, and I did reach down in my bag and got my camera and took his picture. But I do love to hand quilt when you get the top piece together. Sometimes the material is so fine and nice, and you put that sharp little needle through there, and you try to pick up 12 stitches on a needle, and it's like cutting through butter. It's just so smooth, and it can be really hypnotic, and you just kind of get lost in your thoughts. And then if you get overwhelmed with the enormity of the job ahead of you of quilting a whole big quilt, sometimes that's why people do lap quilts and stuff like that, because they're smaller and you can accomplish something and it doesn't take you years and years to do. And sometimes it does take you a couple years to do a quilt.
Would you like to share any words of wisdom?
You think that when you're young that you have many, many years to accomplish all this stuff, and then as you get older, your hands get a little bit more stiff, and your back gets a little sore, and your eyesight might not be as good as it once was, and you start thinking that the mark I've made on the world is my 5 children, but then it's whatever they do in their life that they'll have to answer for. But when I'm gone, people will see those quilts, and it's part of the history. It's just a little mark I made on the earth, and it's my history. It's my family's history. Every one of the quilts has a story, and they have memories for me, and people will just remember me for what I have done and not the things that I didn't have time to do. But I always was interested in art. My dad was an artist, and to me, it is an art form. It's not just a craft. It's something that when you're done, it has a use.
I'm glad I was able to share with you what I know will be a tradition in my family, because I plan on passing down the patterns, stories, and techniques that are involved with quilting. No matter how much the patterns change and how many more are invented, the quilts that my mom and I have made together are so unique to us and our family, no one would ever be able to recreate them. I wouldn't even be able to recreate them. Like my mom said, these quilts have memories, and I plan on keeping those memories and passing them down with the quilts, and someday creating my own little memories that will stick with me for life.